The Forest of Lost Souls. There was a legend that no one in the small town of Briarwood dared to speak aloud, a tale so whispered in fear that it was nearly forgotten. At the edge of the town stood a vast, dense forest, one that had claimed countless lives over the centuries. Its trees, old and gnarled, towered like ancient sentinels, casting long, haunting shadows. The locals called it the Forest of Lost Souls. Generations before, the forest had been a place of beauty, a refuge from the world. But over time, it changed. People who entered rarely came back. Those who did returned hollow-eyed, their minds shattered, their words incoherent. They spoke of voices, shadows, and something far worse than death lurking between the trees. Briarwood knew better than to explore its depths. They built their town as far from the forest as possible, leaving only warnings to the curious travelers who wandered near. But Sarah, young, brash, and new to town, had never been one to heed warnings. She had moved to Briarwood only 6 months earlier, taking up a job as a photographer for a small nature magazine. Intrigued by the town's mystery and driven by a curiosity that bordered on obsession, Sarah decided to investigate the legend. Her friends warned her, of course, but Sarah wasn't the type to let stories dictate her choices. The world was full of tales meant to frighten children, she reasoned. This was no different. It was a chilly, overcast day when she set off with her camera slung over her shoulder. She left early, just after sunrise, wanting to capture the morning light as it filtered through the dense canopy of the trees. She wore a heavy jacket and hiking boots, confident in her survival skills and assured that the forest wouldn't be any different than the others she'd ventured into for her work. The forest's entrance was marked by an old wooden sign, its lettering faded with time. "Beware the Forest of Lost Souls." Sarah smiled to herself, shaking her head at the melodrama of it all. The wind whispered through the trees, as if beckoning her closer, urging her to step beyond the invisible barrier between safety and the unknown. Without hesitation, she walked forward, her boots crunching on the dry leaves beneath her. For the first mile, it was like any other forest. The sounds of birds chirping, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, and the soft hum of insects created an ambience of calm. She took pictures of moss-covered rocks, towering pines, and the occasional deer track, feeling the thrill of discovery pulsing through her veins. But as the hours passed, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting unnaturally, their bark blackened as if scorched by fire. The sunlight that had filtered through the leaves earlier was now dim, as if the very canopy above had thickened, blocking out the sky. The air grew colder, heavier, making it hard to breathe, and the birds, once loud and cheerful, were now silent, eerily silent. Sarah paused, her brow furrowing. The forest was supposed to be vast, but something was off. It felt closer. The trees seemed to be crowding around her, their trunks looming, pressing in from all sides. A shiver ran down her spine, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. She continued deeper, her steps slower, more cautious. Her camera felt heavier around her neck, and for the first time since she'd entered the forest, doubt began to creep into her mind. She glanced at her watch. It had stopped working. The second hand was frozen in place, unmoving. Her heart began to race. She tapped the watch, shook it, but it didn't budge. She cursed under her breath and pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. The screen flickered unnervingly before going black. Panic started to bubble up in her chest, but she forced it down. She was a professional. She had navigated forests before. She knew how to handle herself. But as she turned to head back, she realized she didn't know which way was forward anymore. The path she had followed was gone. The trees had shifted, their trunks now in places where they hadn't been before. Every direction looked the same, endless rows of twisted, blackened wood stretching into the gloom. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She spun in a slow circle, trying to orient herself, but it was futile. The forest had swallowed her whole. The air grew colder still, and with it came a sound, faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of her heart. It was a voice, distant, carried on the wind like a whisper. Sarah. Her blood froze. She stood stock still, straining to listen. There it was again, a soft, eerie call, her name being spoken by something out there in the trees. Sarah, come closer. Her pulse quickened. No one knew she was here. No one could possibly know her name. She turned slowly, scanning the forest for any sign of movement, but the trees were still, and the underbrush was undisturbed. She took a step back, her breath coming in short gasps. Then another step. The voice came again, louder this time, closer. Sarah, why do you run? The voice was unmistakably familiar now, her mother's voice. But her mother was hundreds of miles away, back in the city. Her throat went dry. This wasn't possible. She turned and bolted, her feet pounding the forest floor as she ran blindly through the trees. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. Sarah, don't leave us. Now the voices were many, overlapping, echoing through the forest, growing louder with every step. They were children, women, men, all calling out to her, begging her to stay. Her legs burned. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. The trees blurred past her, the forest around her a twisted maze of darkness and shadow. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get out. And then she saw it, a figure standing just ahead, silhouetted against the faint glow of the setting sun. Relief surged through her. Help! She screamed, her voice cracking. Please help me. The figure didn't move. As she drew closer, her relief turned to horror. It wasn't a person at all. The figure was a shadow, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, and its long, skeletal fingers reached out towards her. She skidded to a stop, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadow figure moved closer, its grin widening as it whispered her name. Sarah. She stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. Her camera clattered to the dirt beside her, forgotten. She scrambled to her feet, but the figure was gone. The whispers were all around her now, circling her like a storm. She could feel them closing in, pressing against her, suffocating her. And then, out of the darkness, they appeared, the lost souls. They emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly, their bodies twisted and broken. Some were missing limbs, others had faces contorted in eternal agony. They moved slowly, silently, their hollow eyes fixed on her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body was frozen in place, paralyzed by terror. The souls circled her, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. Join us, Sarah. Be one of us. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, she whispered. Please, no. But the souls didn't stop. They pressed closer, their cold, skeletal hands reaching out to her. And then, everything went dark. Days passed before the search party was sent out to look for Sarah. They combed the forest, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. No footprints, no broken branches, no evidence that she had ever been there. But deep in the heart of the forest, where the trees grew black and twisted, where the light never touched the ground, a camera lay forgotten on the forest floor. Its battery was dead, but inside was a single photograph of a young woman, her face pale, her eyes hollow, standing among the trees. And behind her, in the shadows, the lost souls watched, waiting for their next victim.